Boardroom Bound, episode 153, Exploring the Evolving ESG Landscape in the Boardroom, with Paul Washington.
And I would say that ESG and all of this, it invites boards and encourages boards to look at all of their business decisions through that broader aperture of multiple stakeholders, society at large, and the natural environment. They're allowed to do it under the law. I think actually if they do that, it's likely going to result in higher and better long-term performance.
Hello and welcome to this episode of Boardroom Bound. My name is Alexander Lowry and this is the podcast dedicated to intentional leadership in the boardroom. My goal is to give aspiring and existing directors the tips, tactics, and strategies necessary to transform your confidence and build a successful career as a board director. Quick reminder, you can get all of today's show notes at podcast.gordon.edu. And in today's episode, we're speaking with Paul Washington, who is the Executive Director of the ESG Center at the Conference Board. Prior to that, he spent 20 years at Time Warner, including roles as the Deputy General Counsel and Corporate Secretary, which involved a lot of board work. Paul estimates it's about 700 board interactions he had there. So he has gone through it. He has been there. He has done it. He's going to reveal some of the great strategies and experiences about how you can be your best board member. Before we jump into today's show, I'd like to share a message from our sponsor about director certification. Want to join your first board, or are you looking for additional board seat opportunities? In either scenario, be sure to be disciplined in your approach. Now, through the Becoming an Exceptional Board Director Candidate Coaching and Certification course, you get both modern board director candidate packaging and modern board operations knowledge integrated within one program. Remember, the key to landing additional or your first board seat is in your packaging. Make the effort to do it right. Program graduates also receive their globally recognized International Board Director Competency Designation upon course completion. It's designed for individuals and groups. You can learn more at bit.ly/IBDC-D. That's bit.ly, bit.ly/IBCDC-D. And now let's jump into the show. Paul Washington, welcome to the Boardroom Bound podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
And I should say welcome back. You are in the illustrious club for the Boardroom Bound podcast, two-timers. We were joking before it started that this is our version of the five-timers host for Saturday Night Live. So glad to have you back.
Thanks, and delighted to be in such exclusive company.
Well, it seems like a lifetime ago when we did episode 78. So for anyone who might have missed it and they're binging as they've gone through it, let's start with a bit of an introduction today because you've got a great background experience. For example, that really senior role that you were in at Time Warner, which I'm sure gave you great insights to the boardroom space and how people work together well, or perhaps not in some cases, and in the role that you're doing now and how that builds upon that.
Sure. So currently, I'm Executive Director of the ESG Center at the Conference Board. The Conference Board has been around since 1916. It's the world's leading independent, nonpartisan think tank that's been devoted to serving business and society, for well over a century. And the center I run, the ESG Center, focuses on corporate governance, sustainability, and corporate citizenship. We've got about 180 members. And we serve those members by helping them address their ESG priorities, but we also have a much broader social mission in trying to help companies more broadly become better corporate citizens. And I came to this job after a 20-year run at Time Warner. For most of the time, I was Senior Vice President, Deputy General Counsel, and Corporate Secretary. I took on the role with the Board of Directors right after the AOL Time Warner merger in 2001, but then saw it through, dealing with accounting scandals, dealing with Carl Icahn trying to take over the company, Rupert Murdoch trying to take over the company, multiple spinoffs, sort of almost everything you could go through at a company. I was fortunate to be there in an industry that was undergoing fundamental transition, and then I stayed with the company through the sale to AT&T, where I worked for a while as well. So in my time there, I booked 689 board and committee meetings.
Now that is an incredible training ground. So you've got the T-shirt and the scars to prove it, right?
Both, yeah. yes.
Well, this is an amazing opportunity to take some of those experiences, and now you're obviously working with your 180 odd board members and talking with them about best practices and perhaps things to avoid as well. But I'd love to just pause for a second because you talked about where you're working and you're focused on the ESG Center. ESG means something different to every board member I talk to, different companies, different industries. They all approach it so differently. And I'd love to hear your discussion and thoughts about it. And perhaps maybe this is a good starting point today. What is the best practice advice you give to people when they're thinking about, oh, Paul, we don't handle ESG well. How should we cover this?
Yeah, I think the first bit of advice is don't get hung up on terminology. There are a number of competing terms here, whether you're talking about sustainability or ESG or corporate responsibility or corporate social responsibility. In some ways, I mean, we all know that ESG stands for environmental, social, and governance. And, it's really no more than three food groups, like dairy, meat, and starch, right? And the notion was where derived from in 2004, a UN report, was that basically by focusing on those three areas, a company's performance in those three areas, will help enhance company performance, competitiveness, market performance overall, and be better for society. So ESG is really just those three categories, if you will. But really what's lurking behind that and what it's all about is companies not only serving the long-term welfare of the company and their shareholders, but also serving the long-term welfare of their other stakeholders, society at large, and the natural environment. And companies have the flexibility under our laws to do that, to be conscious when they're making decisions of their broader impact, not just what it means to the bottom line of the company, not just what it means for shareholder value, but what it means for other constituencies, what it means for society at large and the environment. And I would say that ESG and all of this, it invites boards and encourages boards to look at all of their business decisions through that broader aperture of multiple stakeholders, society at large, and the natural environment. They're allowed to do it under the law, and I think actually if they do that, it's likely going to result in higher and better long-term performance. It doesn't make their job any easier. In fact, it makes their job harder than it is now because they don't just have the North Star of shareholder value only to guide them, but I think it is a path toward greater value creation.
Well, and we know from even just the Business Roundtable rethinking what a corporation should be focused on, the ESG clearly fits with that. And I would actually probably augment your definition to say I would consider additional buckets such as maybe employees, retirees, customers. It grows into so many different facets if you want to drill down underneath it. To me, it's like all those little voices on my shoulder that I'm thinking about.
No, I agree with you. In fact, when you're thinking about your stakeholders, it's your investors, it's your customers, it's your employees, it's your business partners, it's your regulators, it's your communities. It's a whole panoply of different constituencies you should be really thinking about when you're running your company, making decisions.
And in some ways, we can look at this and say, well, it's obvious we should be doing all of that, but it's hard and it's different in different industries. And some organizations put ESG matters under different committees and the structure. So it's probably hard to step back and say, this is the best way to do it, right?
No, and there isn't a single best way to do it. The way I think about it is ESG is sort of what the topics that companies are now talking about. They're talking about a broad array of social and environmental topics than they ever did before. So that's what ESG is. And focusing on, you call it stakeholder capitalism, is the whom are you trying to serve in focusing on those broader topics. So they go hand in hand. A broader array of topics means you're likely serving a broader array of people, and serving a broader array of people means that you're going to engage in a broader array of topics. So they go, the who and the what go hand in hand here. But both are broadening and both becoming more challenging.
And I agree. And it's interesting to to some people and some organizations, or you go to some shareholder meetings, ESG is actually a hot button issue these days. In other places, it's just something we're trying to do better and do more of. And I know that you've been spending a lot of time on, if we go into these hot button issues, and there's so many different topics we could go down, and it's something you've been really spending a lot of time on for interviewing different companies and board members and thinking about it and how organizations are approach it. And it feels like everything is so politicized these days. And there's just so many things people might trip over as they go about trying to do their business, and the world's changing so fast with COVID and supply chain issues and everything else. So let's spend a little bit of time talking about the hot button issues. Maybe you can frame this topic for us before we dive into it.
Sure. And it's I don't know if it destroys the metaphor to sort of have, they call it a minefield of hot and button issues, right? Because it really is. It's really tricky out there. And companies, because they are more trusted and regarded as, they're both regarded as more trustworthy and it's regarded as more competent than other institutions, including government and the media. People, employees and others, are looking to companies to take leadership stands on social issues in a way that hasn't happened sort of ever before. And so this is sort of an unprecedented time for companies that are being asked to take stands on issues, ranging from racism to voting rights to reproductive rights and so forth. And in some ways, this is new to companies. They've taken stands periodically in the past, but the frequency with which they're being asked to take stands, and then as you quite aptly said, the highly politicized and polarized environment in which they're taking these stands make this trickier than ever, because even some things that you would think shouldn't be controversial, like support for democracy, can become highly partisan and polarizing issues depending on how you address them.
Well, to that point, one example that comes to mind, I remember reading a story a year ago about a high-profile CEO in Silicon Valley who gave a large amount of money to both political parties, not picking one or the other. And his employees found this data because everything is publicized. And he was vilified by the employees and forced to resign for supporting candidate X. And his point was like, I didn't support anybody. I just gave money to both sides. And it seems like there's almost a blurring of a line of the company and the individual. If you are the CEO, perhaps in the C-suite, a very high-profile person, of everything you do is associated with you and the firm. So the hot button issues are a bit different. There's no sort of public and private anymore. Is that how you're seeing it?
Yeah, and that's actually one of the big points. We put out a report earlier this year on how companies can make decisions and a difference on social issues. And we highlighted that one of the big risks these days is the conflation of the CEO's personal views with those of the company. And it can go both ways, right? But the real risk is that when the company takes a stand, it will be seen as just reflecting the CEO's own personal political bent. And we think that companies need to steer well clear of that. And it's in the best interest of the company. And frankly, it's in the best interest of the CEO, who may want to keep her or his job, to keep a division between the CEO and the company. And one way to do that, there's some practical ways companies can make sure that there's a separation here. Your CEO can still be the spokesperson. They speak more effectively to multiple audiences than almost anyone else, right? But a company can create some separation by both having clear criteria for when they weigh in on an issue, and you got to make sure that it's an issue that's actually connected to the business, so the company's not just going around being a roving commission commenting on social issues. But very importantly, and this goes particularly to separation point, is to make sure that you've got a clear process for how you for who's involved in whether to take a stand on a social issue. So CEO may make the final decision, but have an internal group of diverse voices that will weigh whether you're going to take a stand on an issue. Consult more broadly beyond that group with business units, with employee resource groups, and so forth. And importantly, along the way, and this is also a matter of CEO survival, make sure that the board is aware of what your process is, and don't surprise your board by taking a stand on a social issue that they can't understand why you did, right? So those are some suggestions as to how to make sure that people don't confuse that when the CEO speaks, they know that the CEO is speaking for the company and not for him or herself.
That's really helpful. I'd love to delve into an example of that where the world has moved so quickly now. And if we go back to, say, the tragedy of George Floyd's death, that was probably the first time for me that I saw so many senior leaders from different sectors, different industries, who I perhaps had never heard use their platform before, coming out and talking either on behalf of the company or maybe even just talking internally to the employees, and that became public. Do both of those scenarios fit into what you're describing?
Yeah, and look, it's interesting because what you want to do, and it's tricky to do both these things, is to make sure that when the company is speaking externally about something, that it's really that whoever's doing the speaking is speaking on behalf of the company, and that they're speaking in a way that is credible. So before a company makes a statement externally, for example, on racism or racial inequality or racial equity, the company's got to have its own house in order before it speaks externally. That's how a company can speak authentically externally. When a CEO is speaking internally, there's a different kind of authenticity at play, which is what we would call CEO recently referred to this in a conversation with him as radical humanity. That when CEOs and other C-suite leaders are addressing topics internally, they also have to be personally authentic about it, and employees will respond well to that. So I know there's a bit of a conundrum here that when you're speaking externally, you're speaking for the company. When you're talking to your employees, they're looking for that authenticity. And the tricky thing for a lot of CEOs these days is that what you say internally often then becomes public. It's one of the challenges of weighing in on social issues, because you want to talk to your employees from the heart, but that can sometimes be challenging when that's then translated out to the outside world.
And let's bring the board into this. And you were going there just a few minutes ago. So let's go into that space a bit as well, because there's an important connectivity. Some issues perhaps must go up to the board. It might be brand new or it rises to that level. Others are something we've done before, but we're pivoting as a result of the way the world has changed. The board needs to be informed and not shocked, but you may not have time to always get to all of them. And of course, it's complicated because maybe not every board member agrees with it. How do you open this part of the can of worms?
Yeah, so this is something we all need to recognize, that taking stance on social issues is not a core competency of most companies, right? And so this is a bit of a brave new world for them. And so I think the proper role for a board here is to make sure that the company does have the right process in place. Do they have reasonable criteria for when they're going to take a stand? Things like, does it align with the company's values? Is there a connection between the issue and the company's business? What are the internal and external expectations for taking a stand on a social issue? How important is the issue to society? And quite importantly, what's the impact the company will have by taking a stand, and can it actually follow through? Because you can take a stand on an issue, it may even have a connection to the business, but if you're not actually making an impact on it, if you can't follow through on it, then maybe you shouldn't be taking the stand. So the board can make sure the company has consistent criteria and a good process, as I mentioned before, for taking a stand on issues. And then, I think and once the board's comfortable with that, then it's incumbent on management to give the board a heads up about, what are the range of issues that this therefore means the company will be taking a stand on. So when the board and management have the conversation about these are the criteria, this is the process, then the very next logical thing for the board to ask is, okay, So what's the scope of issues you're likely to take a stand on? Which are the ones you're going to be very public on, and which are the ones you're going to be less public on? Or maybe you speak only internally, or maybe you speak through third parties, or maybe you don't talk to it at all. And having that conversation with the board is in effect coming up with a company's proactive strategy for dealing with social issues. So you'll have the board understanding the criteria, have the board understanding the process, have the board understanding, where the company is now likely to play in this whole field, and then hopefully management will stay within those guardrails. And I just want to add one caveat to all of this, which is companies aren't obligated to take a stand on social issues at all. I mean, that's a threshold question that management should discuss with the board, but so we're talking about people as if they're going to do this. They don't have to. Companies can very legitimately say, we're just going to stay silent on all of these issues, and that is, that has pros and cons associated with it. But I want to make sure for all the people who are listening that is an alternative on the table for folks to consider.
And perhaps the default, right, of do nothing. And so if we try to channel this from the perspective of our audience who imagine themselves on the board and they're trying to think this through, and they've been working for a long time, they've been executives and they've been very successful by doing, and now they're a board member, right? So the nose in, fingers out, and they're more generally focused on the strategic work than the tactical, because we have to let management do their job and not interfere. There is that red line we want to try and not cross. And I feel like some of these situations sort of bridge that gap between, as you described, we have this sort of tactical approach of this is how we're going to go about doing things. Oh, but this situation either too fast moving or change or something is different. So we've got to be tactical as a result of that. That sounds really hard for a board member to find their right role and place in all of it.
Right, it is hard. But I think the board can still ask some good questions. And one of the good questions they can ask is, a threshold question is, why? Why are you planning to take these stands on these issues, right? What are the costs and benefits of doing it, and have that discussion. So what's the purpose of taking a stand on these issues? It could be employee retention. It could be because it's part of your corporate citizenship DNA, that these are things that are important to the company. It could be because you believe that these are important issues to society and that the company has a role to play. But ask management to articulate and have a conversation with management about why they're doing it. Then you get into the process and the criteria. And another question that the board can ask, which can be very helpful, is, okay, what was the impact of taking a stand on that social issue? What did it do in terms of the company's reputation? What did it do in terms of our relationship with our customers, our business partners, our regulators and policymakers? Did we you don't make this into a popularity contest, right? Because these should be stances that are made based on principle. But, you can ask management, what was the impact of our taking a stand? And did it have a positive impact, which is what you would hope, right? And so directors can ask that question as well. So it's the purpose. It's all about the criteria and process. And then, of course, it's the impact. And those are all legitimate places for the board to play a very constructive role, as management is doing this sort of thing often for the first time, and and management is also finding its way here.
So that makes a lot of sense. And I suppose the other idea that occurs to me when you're thinking about the board is that you want to make sure you're reacting to the right information, the right set of data. You've talked there about asking for that sort of information and feedback. And what a board would always want to be a little bit conscious of is, are we getting the whole picture? Is anything being filtered? Do we have what we need to know? And I wonder whether there are other channels that they might be using. It would vary depending on the situation, but perhaps through the complaints hotline or different ways outside of just the management chain of data to make sure that they have all the information they need.
Yeah, and this is a place where I would first focus on asking management to provide you with the data. And it's often easy for a conversation to go like this. Director says, "So you took a stand on voting rights, and what was the reaction from your customers?" "Oh, some were upset, but it was mostly a wash." All right, then it's fair for the board to say, "Well, could you give me some? What do you base that on? Do you have any data on that? Did we analyze sales? Did we survey employees, right?" And you're not going to do a separate employee survey on each of these things, but as part of your annual survey,
Mm-hmm.
your annual employee engagement survey, you can, companies can collect data on the company's taking stance on these social issues. How do you feel about it? That way, you can get the reaction from your employees. So I think that asking management to supply data to back up their statements on impact is probably the primary way to go. Because the other thing that board members need to be careful of here, if they go off on their own to seek feedback as to, to seek information as to what the reaction was to the company taking a stand on the social issue, is that the board members themselves may suffer from confirmation bias, right? Oh, well, I saw a Facebook post that criticized the company, therefore there must be an uproar about this. Well, not necessarily. So I think it's better for ideally you ask management for hard data as best as possible on the impact here.
That makes a lot of sense. And I'm also just having to think about the time of year where we are, right? So we're approaching year end, which is for most companies a natural inflection point as they think about the strategy for the next year and they're stepping back. And the world has moved a lot in the last 18 months for a variety of reasons. And there might be things like some of these hot button issues before were abnormal, now are becoming a normal part of their business and they're thinking about them regularly. ESG might be a good example, right? We're building these in different ways. How does a board member work and help with the organization to take things that before were just stuff we were reacting to and actually build that into what we do going forward and make it part of our right approach?
So I think you've put your finger on something that's really important, which is ideally companies should not always be in a reactive posture here. Ideally, companies should have a sort of proactive stance and say, these are the things we believe in, and this is how we're going to approach advocacy, whether it's through lobbying or through charitable contributions or through employee volunteering or whatever, that these are the issues we care about, and this is how we're going to approach it. And these are the areas where we're going to take a leadership position. These are the areas where we really want to be known for this. These are the areas where we're going to take a sort of supportive position of what others are doing. And then there are some areas that just don't touch our business that we're going to remain neutral on. Again, this assumes you're planning to take a stand on social issues even at all. But I think that's, you build that into the company's overall approach to these social issues. You have a proactive strategy. And, the place where this sort of fits is as part, boards can talk about this and say, okay, what's our communication strategy? This is one place where this could come up. If the board's asking, what's your plan, management, for the coming year to communicate on these issues? Maybe even better is to say, okay, management, how does this fit with your broader corporate citizenship or sustainability or ESG strategy? Like, these social issues keep coming up. What's our posture going to be on this? And then you have a discussion in the context of your broader citizenship or your broader sustainability strategy with the board on how the company is going to position itself on social issues. Because one thing you don't want to do, the worst kind of thing, is to have the company be in a reactive mode, have the board be surprised, and then have the company's position on social issues become a hotly debated and divisive matter for the board to deal with. That is just a huge distraction for the board of directors. You want to avoid that sort of at all costs.
That makes a lot of sense. And Paul, we've talked about sort of summarizing up like the hot button issues today, which can mean different things to different people depending on where they work and the companies are working with. But when you pull out your crystal ball and you look into the future of the boardroom, that could just be over the course of the next year or perhaps a few years beyond that. Where do you see things going in this space related to this? Are there more hot button issues coming up? Or actually, they won't be hot button. They're just normal. And this, we know how to react to them, and that's okay. What are your thoughts on what it's going to look like down the road?
That's a really good question. I think that over time, companies will have built up a portfolio of issues on which they have taken a stand. And so that it will become a little bit more routine for companies to for boards and management and all other stakeholders to know what their company's position is on a large number of issues, because the companies will have staked out its position or not on those issues. But having said that, I think that one of the big challenges facing companies these days is not it's not the company's statements about social issues. It is the statements and actions of the organizations or the politicians that the company contributes to and their positions on social issues. Because it's hard enough for companies to make sure that their own business and their own statements are aligned with the company's values. The companies can manage that. It is essentially impossible to make sure that the people you give money to, the organizations you support, are also going to be consistently consistent with a company's values. So that's the place where I think the biggest challenges and risks for companies exist, which is not what companies are saying themselves, but frankly what some politicians are saying that you may have given 500 to in the last election cycle.
Well, we know it is never a dull moment being a board member, and this is just another item.
No.
Whether you think it's fun or challenging, it's room for growth at the very least. And I think you've given us great ideas to think, how do we tackle some of these?
It only makes us a better board member,
That's
right?
right. Well, you talked about your nearly 700 board interactions and how much that probably exponentially helped you grow in your boardroom space. And, Paul, thank you so much for coming back on the show, and we were delighted to have you as a return guest, and we appreciate you sharing your insights and helping all of us to be boardroom bound. That's it for this episode of Boardroom Bound. I really enjoyed chatting with Paul Washington. It's fantastic to hear someone who's on the cutting edge talking to board members on a regular basis, trying to give them the best practice guidance, because it is a fast-moving world, as we talked about today. Lots of hot-button issues to tackle. It's challenging, but that's partly also why we enjoy it, right? The board is constantly helping us grow, and it's challenging us. Now remember, if you head over to podcast.gordon.edu, you will find links to all of today's resources, like many of the articles that Paul referenced, his op-ed piece on the topic. And please know that the Boardroom Bound team and I are so proud to be your go-to podcast for all things that connect, prepare, and empower you to land a board seat. Be sure to subscribe to this podcast to not miss any of the high-quality content that we're bringing to you every Wednesday. Thanks for joining me today. I can't wait to share more stories and strategies from brilliant business minds with you again next week. Remember to keep tuning in to be Boardroom Bound.